I know we haven't even hit the month of October yet, but 3 separate Power 5 coaches have already been canned. We saw Scott Frost get canned, obviously, to start things out. Herm Edwards got fired last weekend after losing to Eastern Michigan. And just today, it got finalized. Jeff Collins out at Georgia Tech. So that's now 3 Power 5 coaches that are goners. And I guarantee you they won't be the last 3. Be the second edition of the hot seat series I'm going to do here throughout this 2022 season. Last week we had 10 separate coaches that we looked at. I ranked them 1 through 5, 5 being the hottest of seats and 1 being the safest of positions to be in. We looked at 10 separate coaches. We have a little bit of shakeup here. We did see a few guys be able to play themselves off of that list. Dino Babers. Syracuse is now 4-0. They play Wagner this week. They'll be 5-0 going into the majority of their schedule. I mean, we might have to talk about that later in the year, but Dino Babers is safe, so he's off the list. Jeff Collins, by nature of being fired, is off the list. I had Jimbo Fisher. That seemed a little bit premature, so I kept him off. So did have some guys play themselves off the list in one way or another. This week, though, here after week 4, going into week 5, last week of September, I got 11 coaches for you that I want to look at. Without further ado, let's get right into these hot seat tier rankings and where I see them heading into week 5. All right, we're going to start out with 3 coaches that weren't on last week's video. Bryan Harsin, I got to be honest with you. I'm surprised I didn't receive much pushback for this. Pretty inexplicable to not have him on episode 1 here of the hot seat series. I'm going to put Bryan Harsin as a 4. Do I think it's totally fair? No. Obviously, we know what happened this offseason. There were some allegations made about him that I think from a booster fan perspective, those who didn't like him were kind of pushed in order to reverse a hire that they didn't see working out. So Bryan Harsin has never really gotten a fair shake. Now, on the other hand, he started out last year 6-2, and they lost their last 5 games of the season. So I'm not saying it's totally the boosters, fans' fault. I know Auburn boosters and fans get a lot of criticism from just from the college football landscape. Bryan Harsin is alive another week, more so survived that game against Missouri rather than Auburn just decisively winning that game. They didn't cover, and if you watch that game, they absolutely should have lost that game. Missouri missed a 25-yard field goal that would have won them the game at the end of regulation, and then Missouri fumbled the ball on the 1-yard line in overtime as they were running in the game-winning touchdown. So Bryan Harsin lives another week. I guarantee there were fans that thought, just score, put us out of our misery so we can get rid of this guy. But he's here another week, and I'll tell you, they play LSU this Saturday. They're 8.5-point underdogs at home. With that being said, LSU, they got a first-year head coaching staff with Brian Kelly. LSU's got some major holes. That is a winnable game. And if they can beat LSU, that is a huge, huge win for Bryan Harsin, and he would absolutely drop down a little bit. As much as people already don't like him, I'm going to put him as a 4 for now. You know, a lot of people would tell you 5, and I get it. I still think that I'm holding out hope that they can possibly win this game and extend him a little bit longer. If they lose to LSU, though, there's a good chance that it happens after that loss. If not, he's moving to a 5, and he's one bad loss away from getting canned. So once again, should have included him last week. Kind of egregious I didn't, but we got to it here in week 2. Jeff Hafley wasn't on this list last week. Boston College head coach. Boston College is really surprisingly stunk this year. Off to a 1-3 start. They lost at home to Rutgers in week 1. They got really run off the field against Virginia Tech in week 2. Bounced back with a win against a clearly inferior opponent in week 3. But I mean, they were uncompetitive this past week against Florida State, and I'm high on Florida State, so it's not overly surprising to me. But Florida State, if you kept track with that program heading into last week, they weren't sure if Jordan Travis was going to play. It wasn't a more injured team in college football coming into this past week than Florida State. So a team that wasn't at full strength really just totally smacked Boston College around the field this past Saturday. And that was never a game. So I know he's still in year 3. I personally like Jeff Hafley. I feel like last year his team was set to maybe win 8 games or so. Phil Jurkovec went down, and they just had no offense once they did lose Jurkovec. Well, they got him back this year. They still got Phil Garwell at running back, who he was a 1,000-yard rusher a year ago. Still got Zay Flowers, who's a really good wide receiver, but they don't have the offensive line they had last year, and they lost starting experience across the board. Their offensive line has really let them down here in 2022. I think he's worth including on the list just because if it does continue on this trend, I mean, if they go 3-9 this year, let's say, I think he should absolutely be considered on this list. I don't think it will happen. I actually think that they have we'll get into this when we talk about Scott Satterfield. I think they're like 18.5-point underdogs this week at home against Louisville. I'm not, closing the book on Boston College yet. They got to figure out some of their issues up front. I'm not saying Jeff Hafley is anywhere close to getting fired, but nevertheless, been a really poor start to 2022 and thought he was worth including on this list. One more addition as well, Paul Chryst. Now, if you look at the overall record at Wisconsin for Paul Chryst, he won well over 70% of his games. He's been somewhat competitive, even in the Big Ten title race. But, just ask yourself this, and we saw this on Saturday. It's not that Wisconsin lost to Ohio State. It's that, if you're Wisconsin and you look at yourself as, we should win the Big Ten West this year. All right. So who are we going to play in the Big Ten championship? Ohio State, probably, maybe Michigan. All right. So we get to play Ohio State in the regular season. You got run off the field. If you're a proud program like Wisconsin, I don't care who you're playing. I don't care who their quarterback is. If you pride yourself on, being competitive, you can't go lose that game by 31 points. They obviously also lost against Washington State at home earlier this year, which is certainly the more inexcusable loss. I still don't think that we should overlook getting blown out against a team like Ohio State. That shouldn't go unnoticed. So Paul Chryst has been there quite a while now, and I get it. A good winning percentage. He's never really had just a disastrous year. Has his passing game gotten any better throughout his tenure? The answer is no. Graham Mertz is now in his third year, really shown no development whatsoever. His best game in college was his first start back in 2020. And since then, he has never taken that next step. And you can say, oh, that's on Mertz. But if you're the head coach, that's your responsibility. Either make a change or develop the guy you have. So I think that's a knock on him. I included him here not because, he's 2-2, he's directly on the hot seat. But, Big Ten West, there's a ton of parity in that, side of the Big Ten this year. I think Minnesota looks as good as any team in that division right now. Iowa's got the second best defense in college football. That'll be a tough game for Wisconsin. Illinois, Wisconsin plays Illinois at home this week. They're only a 7-point favorite. So that is anything but a surefire win. Purdue is always tough because they're very, much of clashing styles. Do not assume that this is just going to be another Wisconsin 8-4 season. If they were to go 7-5 this year, I think there would be rumblings. Is this really the guy that we want leading our program long term? I think that, if they continue on this cycle, if they can't get, they've got a really good running game with Braylon Allen, but it's going to get wasted once again if they can get some dependability out of that quarterback position. Wisconsin still have some of the same issues that they had at the beginning of the Paul Chryst era, and quite honestly, they're not playing like a Big Ten contender right now. All right, on to some of the guys we did talk about last week. Pat Fitzgerald, we had him at a 3 last week. What did he do? Once again, another home loss to an inferior opponent. Lost 17-14 to Miami, Ohio. So since that Nebraska game in Ireland, the Wildcats are now 0-3, and all 3 of those losses have come against inferior competition at home. I'm going to keep him as a 3, and I talked about this a lot last week. It's very much dependent on what institution you're at. He's been there long enough. He's built up enough goodwill to where, at Northwestern, they don't care as much about football as a lot of these SEC, Big 12, Big 10 schools. So if he was at another program, if he was at Auburn, he'd already be gone. Right. But it's just a different dynamic there. I think you can make a pretty good argument he's at a 4 because this is 3 straight home losses in games that you probably shouldn't have lost any of them, quite honestly. So I could see that argument. With that being said, he's one of the more tenured coaches in college football. He's been at Northwestern a long time. I feel like at places like that, you're going to get the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to keep him as a 3, but he's definitely pushing that 4 category. They play at Penn State this week. Probably won't be competitive in that game. Wisconsin, Maryland, Iowa, Ohio State, Minnesota. Where are the wins on this schedule? I don't know. I don't see it. Should I move him to a 4? Comment down below. Is he a 3 or a 4? I'm going to keep him as a 3. If he could, he's probably going to continue to lose, and if he does, we'll move him up a little bit. But for now, Pat Fitzgerald will stay a 3. Big win for Neal Brown at West Virginia. They beat Virginia Tech on Thursday night this past week. They moved to 2-2 on the season. I had him as a 4 last week, and I'm going to keep him there. A lot of people would have told you he was at a 5 entering this past game. Listen, that was a must-win game for West Virginia. If you would have lost at Virginia Tech, might have already gotten fired. So big win for him. They play at Texas this week. You see Bevo in the background. Not going to give an opinion there. They are, nearly double-digit dogs in that game. If they were to lose at Texas, I don't think that's necessarily going to be when they move on. It's more so going to be, I mean, they play Baylor on a Thursday night. They have a bye week after Texas. Then they play Baylor, Texas Tech, TCU, Iowa State. They probably need to win 3 out of those 4 games for him to keep his job, especially Tech and TCU. Those are first-year head coaching staffs. Iowa State is reshuffling a lot from what they had a year ago. There are going to be opportunities here to where West Virginia is going to have some must-win games. I don't think it's this Saturday in Austin against a pretty talented Texas team. Step one, you had to beat Virginia Tech, and he did. But he's nowhere near out of the woods yet. And this is just a crazy conference, too. There's so much parity. I don't think there's any surefire wins or losses on West Virginia's schedule throughout the rest of the way. Still going to keep him as a 4, and don't think really this week's result, if they were to lose at Texas, is going to move that needle much. All right, quick break in the action. I know you see the shirt right here. I know you've been staring at it the whole time. If you're wondering, how can I look as cool and sexy as that guy on that screen in front of me? I'll tell you. Proud90.com, unique but very comfortable polos as well. Go to proud90.com and browse their selection. Obviously, you got polos, but hoodies, quarter zips, t-shirts. They recently added a ladies line if you want to treat that special someone. Proud 90's got all your golf apparel needs. If you see anything you like at checkout, use code Fordham. It's going to get you 15% off of your entire order. That's code Fordham. It's going to get you 15% off your entire order. Support me. Support Proud 90. The rest of the information will be in the description below. Let's get right back into the video. All right, Scott Satterfield at Louisville. We had him at a 5 last week. We're going to keep him at a 5. I know Louisville beat the brakes off of South Florida. 41-3 win at home. I mean, quite frankly, though, that's a team that you should be beating the brakes off. So I don't think that's going to really, I mean, for those boosters there, it's like, I mean, that's what we're supposed to do to teams like that. When we have a 4th-year starting quarterback, when we have a clear talent advantage, and South Florida's defense is terrible. So he is anything from out of the weeds. Thankfully, though, things do get easier. They play back-to-back road games, but both of these opponents are pretty manageable. At Boston College this weekend, and that following weekend they go at Virginia. I think he probably needs to win both of those games, if you're asking me, because each of those teams has looked so poor this year to where I feel like he's already in kind of hot water. We've talked about that specifically last week. If you were to drop either of those games to inferior opponents, I feel like he wouldn't be getting much support from anybody. So I think that they could lose one of those games. It's hard to play back-to-back road games in college football and college basketball. It's a spot that I look to fade teams in, especially that second straight road game. I'll say this, though. Boston College is a team that still has talent. They haven't put it together this year. I could see a world where, I mean, we saw Louisville in the first game of the season come out flat at Syracuse. How do you come out flat in the first game of the season? Those are things that happen with teams that are not on solid ground. So Louisville's not on solid ground. They could absolutely throw up a clunker in one of these next 2 games. And if they do, Scott Satterfield's probably done. All right, Eli Drintwitz. I mean, we talked about it a little bit with Auburn and how they were able to really just kind of, steal a win away from Missouri. We had Drintwitz as a 2 last week. I think he's kind of crept up into that 3 category. I know it's his 3rd year, but only that loss. I mean, we've seen some rumblings. One of the really talented freshman receivers that Drintwitz was really hanging his hat on from this past recruiting cycle, did the old, delete his social media, delete his Missouri stuff thing. So that'll be something to watch out for. Just kind of what I saw from him last year. Missouri really kind of beat the teams they were supposed to beat. But, I mean, if you're going to win and keep your job at a place like Missouri, you've got to be able to pull off some upsets. And he hasn't really shown that ability. I mean, I know they beat Florida last year, but Florida had basically quit by that point in the season. I mean, listen, they play Georgia this weekend. Obviously, they're going to get smoked. They're going to have to win some of these games, like at Florida. They're going to need to be competitive there. At South Carolina is a game that I feel like they think that they need to win that game. I mean, they get Kentucky and Arkansas at home. That's the issue. It's just the SEC, it's so talent rich. This is not one of the better jobs in the SEC. I mean, Missouri has been successful before, but it's not an easy situation to walk into. And I just haven't seen enough from Eli Drintwitz yet to make me think that he's going to have his team ready to step up in competition in some of these games. I mean, they found a way to lose at Auburn. They got smoked at Kansas State. So I think 3 is a good spot for him. It's year 3. And I personally, the biggest mistake he made, he didn't go out and get a good transfer quarterback this offseason. I think that's a move that he's going to look back and really regret. Brady Cook is not that guy. He's not a difference-making player whatsoever. I think Eli Drintwitz rightfully is starting to feel the heat a little bit. All right, Justin Wilcox had a good weekend. First of all, Cal beat Arizona 49-31. We talked about how mediocre their offense was last week. And what do? They immediately go put up 49 points in a conference game. I mean, they got this running back, Jaden Ott, 19 carries for 274 yards. That came out of nowhere. We had him at a 3 last week. We kind of had him right there with Fitzgerald and then David Shaw. I think in a place like Cal, a win like that is going to help you out very considerably. Responded to a lot of the criticism we had last week. So I am going to move him down to a 2. Also, their only loss this year is at Notre Dame. They had a chance right down to the end to win that game. And Notre Dame, that loss doesn't look as bad now, given how they just won convincingly at North Carolina. So, kind of in 2 separate ways. Justin Wilcox kind of helped out his cause this weekend. Plus, once again, he's at an academic first school. Wins like that are going to give him a lot more leeway than maybe at other programs. I feel like people at Cal are going to have a very short memory to some of the mediocrity within that program. We'll see if they're able to really sustain that offensive explosiveness we saw on Saturday. I mean, they play a tough game at Washington State this Saturday. I think that'll be a really good test for them. Regardless, though, good weekend for Justin Wilcox. So he does move down from a 3 to a 2. Tom Allen, Indiana, we had him as a 2 last week. They lost by 21 at Cincinnati, but that's kind of how that game was expected to go. I don't think that really changes much. I'm going to keep him at a 2. It's not necessarily that he's on the hot seat now, with Maryland stepping up in the Big Ten, with having to play Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State. This is just a tough schedule for Indiana. So it's not, they're 3-1. It's not like he's on the hot seat now. But if you project the rest of the schedule, if they don't make a bowl game, I think it's worthwhile to say he's on the hot seat. This is his 7th year. I didn't realize that it was even this poor for Tom Allen. He's only had 2 winning seasons at Indiana in his prior 6 seasons. And one of those was the shortened 2020 season when everybody fell in love with that Indiana team. And they went 2-10 last year. So I think it is safe to say that they do need to make a bowl game this year. And that probably does keep him safe. I'm not willing to concede that that's going to happen, though. Their schedule is about to get a lot tougher. Even when they play teams like Rutgers. Who's to say that Rutgers couldn't beat Indiana? I'm going to keep him as a 2 because I think this is more projecting as to how the season is going to unfold for Indiana, but probably one that we're going to have to track and touch on as the season progresses. All right, Karl Dorrell for Colorado. I had him as a 4 last week. He very well may be the next guy to go. Obviously going to upgrade him to a 5. Colorado is the worst Power 5 team in the country. They got blown out by TCU to start the year. They got blown out by Air Force. They lost to Air Force by 31 points. Got blown out by Minnesota, and then they got blown out here this past weekend against UCLA. There is nothing to be encouraged about. And Karl Dorrell, obviously had a lot of guys leave the program this past offseason, reshuffled the staff. Brought in Mike Sanford to run that offense, who saw the negative effect he had at Minnesota. Well, why would you bring that in to run your system when you're already kind of on thin ice? It's just been a disaster for Karl Dorrell. You're talking about 4 straight blowouts to start the season. You go play at Arizona this week. Who's to say that Arizona's not going to blow them out too? I just don't see where the path forward for Karl Dorrell is. This team could legitimately go winless this year. I think we said that last week, and it kind of makes it, I don't know why I even had him as a 4. He's clearly a 5 until he at least gets somewhat competitive in these games. He's going to remain a 5, and he probably won't even get that chance. Not much going right for Karl Dorrell right now. He could be the next one to go. All right, finishing it off with David Shaw, very similar to Pat Fitzgerald, and a lot of this we said last week too. But David Shaw and Stanford didn't really look that competitive this past weekend at Washington. I know a lot of people love this Washington team, but if you're big bad Stanford, which David Shaw has led that program to a lot of success, we're starting to get further and further away from a lot of that success, though. Stanford has really started to bottom out to where they aren't going to be competitive in those type of games. And we saw it again this past Saturday. Once again, Stanford and Northwestern, if they were more focused on athletics, these guys wouldn't be a 3. If it's performance-based, it's a 4, maybe even a 5. And in the case of Pat Fitzgerald, David Shaw is definitely playing the easier schedule this year. He's still got talent with Tanner McKee at quarterback. He's got some good playmakers. He's even got some stuff in his secondary. I think there are good individual players on the Stanford roster. They're not good in the trenches, and they're just not a good team is really what it comes down to. They play at Oregon this week. Good luck. Come back and play Oregon State. Good luck. At Notre Dame, good luck. That's the problem. It's just Stanford is a collective unit. It's just not going to really step up well in most of those matchups. So it's tough for me to look at this and say, I mean, David Shaw and Pat Fitzgerald, why are they not a 4, maybe even a 5? I think you can make that argument. It's only because of where they're at. Neither of them losing this past week should have been all that surprising, but it's still pretty, poor nonetheless. So both those guys are absolutely worthy of being on this list. Alrighty, guys, that's going to do it for episode 2 of this hot seat series. Obviously, we're talking about coaches' jobs, and I get it. This is an element of college football that I think we all need to keep track of. If you're handicapping games, you probably don't want to be betting on guys that are coaching for their job, or maybe you do. This is noteworthy stuff to talk about. So this is a series we're going to do every week. I wanted to address something too. Obviously, with these vacancies coming open, like Georgia Tech, like Nebraska, like Arizona State, I feel like a lot of those jobs will get resolved kind of later in the year after the regular season. I mean, obviously, if a guy like Jamie Chadwell at Coastal Carolina is going to leave Coastal, it would happen after the regular season. I'm going to have plenty of coverage on that when the time comes around. For now, though, we're just going to kind of be tracking the hot seat. I appreciate everybody tuning in. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Like the video too. That really helps out the growth of this channel. And then comment any guys that I might have forgotten. I don't think I did. And I want to say this is just Power 5 coaches only. I forgot to mention that on last week's episode. I don't think I mentioned it on the intro today. Power 5 coaches only. I'll be back here throughout the week with all my individual game breakdowns, previews, and predictions, and what should be a great Week 5 slate.